The scent of the lighthouse was a specific, heavy thing. Salt cured into old iron, damp wool, and the sharp, chemical bite of lantern oil. It hit you the moment the heavy steel door clicked shut, sealing out the wind. But tonight, standing in the narrow, circular lantern room, I wasn't noticing the smell. I was noticing the heat. Mara stood 3 feet away, adjusting the rotation gear. My chest felt tight, a physical pressure that made my research notes blur. I had come here for solitude, for the clean, cold logic of data. Instead, I found myself tracking the movement of her hands, fighting a sudden, terrifying urge to close the distance. It started 6 weeks ago, the moment the boat engine cut out. The supply boat didn't linger. The captain, a man who spoke in grunts and nods, unloaded my crates of sampling equipment onto the slick, moss-covered jetty and reversed engines before I had even secured my footing. I watched the wake dissolve into the gray chop of the Atlantic. And when the sound of the motor faded, the silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressing down like deep water. The wind tore at the hood of my jacket, a constant low roar that erased everything else. I turned to face the tower. That was the first time I really saw her. Mara was waiting at the top of the metal stairs, looking down at me with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile. It was assessing. She came down to help with the gear. She didn't offer a hand to shake. She just grabbed the heaviest crate, the one filled with glass sample bottles, and hoisted it onto her shoulder like it was filled with feathers. "Watch the third step," she said, her voice low and rough, like gravel rolling in the surf. "It's loose. I haven't had the parts to fix it yet." We hauled everything up to the living quarters. The lighthouse was built for function, not comfort. The kitchen and living space were a single curved room wrapped around the central stone pillar. A small wood stove sat in the center, and 2 narrow bunks were built into the walls on opposite sides. It was intimate by necessity, a forced proximity that felt professional but invasive. There were no corners to hide in, just the endless curve of stone. I could smell the cedar soap she used. I could hear the fabric of her jacket rustle as she moved. I started unpacking immediately, needing to establish my own territory. I arranged my logbooks, my sensors, my water testing kits. I had fought hard for this grant. I needed this time away. After the mess in the city, the faculty dinners where I introduced my partner as a friend, the sudden silences when we walked into a room, the humiliating public breakup, I wanted a world where the only variables were tide levels and salinity. I wanted cold, hard numbers. I didn't want complications. Our first dinner was a study in avoidance. We ate soup at the small, bolted-down table, our knees inches apart. She said, not looking up from her bowl. I replied, keeping my voice neutral. She looked up then. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and unsettlingly direct. I said, defensive. She said. She held my gaze for a second too long. It wasn't a challenge. It was a calibration. She was measuring me, seeing if I would break under the isolation. I looked back, refusing to blink, until she finally nodded and stood to clear the table. My pulse hammered against my ribs, loud in the sudden quiet. I retreated to my bunk early, pulling the wool blanket up to my chin, but I could still hear her breathing across the room, a steady, rhythmic sound that made sleep impossible. I realized then that the stone walls didn't just keep the weather out. They held the tension in, coiling it tighter with every passing hour. Mornings in the tower had a specific rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that I learned to set my internal clock to. It wasn't the sun that woke me. The windows were too thick, salt-crusted and narrow. But the sound of the rotation gears disengaging 3 floors up. A heavy, metallic thunk that vibrated through the stone, followed by the silence of the light dying out. That was the signal. I would roll out of the bunk, the floorboards cold enough to bite through my wool socks, and find Mara already moving. She was a creature of dawn, functioning with a terrifying clarity while the rest of the world was still blurred by sleep. The routine was always the same. She would be at the small galley counter, the manual coffee grinder clamped between her knees as she turned the crank. The sound was a harsh, rhythmic crunching that filled the circular room, aggressive and domestic all at once. The smell of dark roast hit the air a moment later, overriding the pervasive scent of damp stone. It was the only luxury she allowed herself, beans shipped from a roaster in the city she claimed to hate. I would sit at the table, wrapping my hands around a ceramic mug before she even poured the water, watching her. There was a competence to her movements that I found unexpectedly grounding. She didn't just make coffee, she engineered it. She didn't just check the weather logs, she interrogated them. "Barometer dropped again," she said one morning, not looking up from the logbook. Her handwriting was sharp, angular, nothing like the looping script I expected. "Stormfront?" I asked, voice still rough with sleep. "Maybe, or just the ocean breathing in." She slid a mug toward me, black, steam rising in a perfect column. I took a sip, the heat spreading through my chest. "You're good at this," I said. "The solitude. Most keepers burn out in 6 months. You've been here 3 years. Mara leaned back against the stone wall, blowing on her own cup. The gray morning light washed out the room, making her look like a black and white photograph. "I didn't come here to hide, if that's what you're asking." "I didn't ask." "You didn't have to. Everyone wonders." She took a drink, her eyes fixed on the horizon through the window. "I spent 10 years in a glass office in the city. High-rise. Air conditioning that recycled the same stale breath. I was a logistics manager for a shipping conglomerate. I moved things I never saw to places I'd never visit." I stared at her. The image of Mara in a suit, contained by drywall and fluorescent lights, felt impossible. She seemed carved out of the same granite as the lighthouse. "That sounds suffocating." "It was loud," she corrected. "Not the noise, the expectations, the constant buzzing pressure to be something performative. Here?" She gestured to the stone walls, the vast, empty ocean beyond. "The ocean doesn't care if I'm polite. It just cares if I keep the light on." She looked at me then, her gaze stripping away the polite defenses I usually kept up. "You know the feeling," she said. It wasn't a question. I admitted. She didn't wait for me to confirm it. She just finished her coffee in one long swallow and stood up to check the lens. But the silence that settled between us after that wasn't heavy anymore. It had shifted. It wasn't the awkward silence of 2 strangers trapped in a tower. It was the comfortable, companionable silence of 2 people who understood the weight of what they had left behind. We moved around each other in the small kitchen, shoulders brushing as I reached for the sugar, hips bumping as she grabbed a rag. We didn't apologize. We just adjusted, falling into a shared solitude that felt dangerous precisely because it felt so easy. The lantern room was a greenhouse of heat and light, a stark contrast to the damp chill of the living quarters below. It was narrow, dominated by the massive, prismed beehive of the Fresnel lens that sat in the center like a sleeping giant. We were squeezed into the service gallery, a walkway barely wide enough for 1 person, let alone 2. One of my external atmospheric sensors had fouled, salt corrosion eating through the wiring harness, and Mara had insisted on helping me splice the line before the next front moved in. She murmured, her voice vibrating through the floorboards I was kneeling on. She was leaning over me, her boots planted wide for balance, her torso twisted to reach the junction box. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a tangible warmth that seemed to mock the cold glass pressing against my back. I held the plastic housing, my fingers aching from the cold, while she stripped the wire with a small, sharp knife. The space was impossible. To work the angle, she had to brace her forearm against the wall, effectively caging me in. Every time she shifted her weight, the fabric of her work pants brushed against my shoulder. I told myself it was just physics. 2 bodies, 1 small space, 0 margin for error. I told myself I was focused on the copper wire exposed to the air. But my pulse was hammering a frantic, traitorous rhythm against my ribs. She said, not looking down. I reached for the tool on the floor at the same time she dropped her hand to find it. It wasn't a collision, it was a graze. The back of her hand brushed against the inside of my wrist, right where the skin is thinnest, where the pulse jumps. Time didn't stop. That's a cliché for poets. Instead, time thickened. It coagulated around us, heavy and slow. The contact lasted maybe half a second, but the sensation seared into my nervous system like a brand. It wasn't a spark. Sparks are fleeting. This was a coil, a sudden, violent tightening of tension that snapped the air out of my lungs. The casual, professional distance we had carefully constructed over weeks of coffee and weather logs evaporated instantly, leaving something raw and terrifyingly honest in its wake. I should have pulled away. Instinct dictates that when you touch something hot, you recoil. But I didn't. I left my hand there, hovering in the charged space where hers had just been. And she didn't pull back either. Mara froze. Her hand hovered over the tool, her fingers curled slightly. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the tower was the wind screaming against the glass and the ragged intake of my own breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, she turned her head. She looked down at me. There was no surprise in her face, no polite, socially mandated apology waiting on her lips. Her eyes were dark, dilated in the bright light, and they held mine with an intensity that felt like a physical grip. It was an unflinching assessment. She wasn't asking if I was okay. She was acknowledging exactly what had just happened. She was stripping away the excuse of, quote, 28, quote, and leaving us with the naked reality of the pull. She said finally. Her voice was lower than usual, stripped of its efficient edge. It was husky, quiet. I managed to choke out. My voice sounded thin, foreign to my own ears. I grabbed the tool and pressed it into her palm. Our fingers didn't brush this time. They met. The transfer was deliberate. I felt the calluses on her palm, the rough warmth of her skin, and for a terrifying second, I thought she was going to close her hand around mine instead of the steel handle. The urge to turn my hand over, to lace my fingers through hers and pull her down into the cramped space with me was so sudden and so violent it made me dizzy. She took the tool. The contact broke. "Got it," she said, turning back to the wire. But her movements had lost their fluid precision. She fumbled the crimp once, cursed softly, and had to reset. I stayed frozen against the glass, my wrist still burning where she had touched me. It wasn't just proximity. I knew that now. You can be close to someone in a crowded subway car and feel nothing but annoyance. This was specific. This was directional. It was a magnetic drag that made every cell in my body want to orient toward her. When we finished the repair, we descended the spiral stairs in silence. It wasn't the comfortable silence of the morning. It was a silence loaded with things we were terrified to say. I went straight to my bunk and pulled the curtain, staring at the stone ceiling. My wrist still tingled, and I knew, with a sinking, thrilling dread, that I was lying to myself. I spent the next 48 hours constructing a fortress out of silence and busy work. I stopped taking my coffee at the table. Instead, I poured it into a travel mug and retreated to the lower level where I had set up my makeshift lab, claiming I needed to calibrate the dissolved oxygen sensors. It was a flimsy lie. Those sensors were digital and self-correcting, but it gave me a door to close. I focused obsessively on the water samples, labeling vials with a precision that bordered on manic. I tried to reduce the world to clear glass and saline solutions, because if I looked up, if I let my mind drift from the data, I was back in the lantern room, feeling the phantom heat of her hand on my wrist. It wasn't just the attraction that terrified me. It was the history attached to it. Attraction in a vacuum is easy. Attraction in a small, closed ecosystem is a grenade. That pressure had cracked my last relationship down the middle. We hadn't ended because we stopped loving each other. We ended because the effort of hiding had worn us down to nothing. I had come here to escape that calibration, and now, in the most isolated place on the map, I found myself doing the math again. If I stand here, is it too close? If I look at her too long, will she see the want? Mara noticed the retreat, of course. You can't hide in a lighthouse. She didn't chase me, though. That was almost worse. If she had pushed, if she had asked, "What's wrong?" I could have deflected. But she just let me go. Her presence became louder in its absence. I could hear her boots on the metal stairs, the clang of the wood stove door, the scratch of her pen in the logbook. She moved around my silence like water flowing around a rock. Steady, patient, eroding my edges without force. On the third evening, I couldn't avoid the common area. The storm surge had fouled the lower intake pipe, and I needed the heavy wrench from the tool locker next to the stove. Mara was there, reading a paperback with the spine broken in 3 places. She didn't look up when I entered, but the air in the room shifted instantly. The temperature seemed to jump 10 degrees. "Town boat is coming in 2 days," she said. Her voice was calm, not looking up from the page. "Do you need anything added to the list?" I paused, hand on the locker latch. "No, I have everything I need." "Sure," she said. She turned a page. "Just thought you might want something from the mainland. A newspaper, some connection to the real world." "I'm fine," I said, too quickly. "I don't miss it." "I didn't say you missed it. I said you might want to know what they're saying." She finally looked up then, marking her place with a finger. "That's what you're worried about, isn't it? What people say." I froze. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" She closed the book. "You think I don't know what they say about me in town? Crazy Mara, living in the tower, the hermit. They have a million stories. None of them are true." "Does it bother you?" I asked. "Why would it?" She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, catching my gaze and holding it. "They're out there. I'm in here. The walls are 3 feet thick granite. Nothing gets in unless I open the door." The subtext hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't talking about the town. She was talking about us. She was telling me that the fear I was carrying, the fear of exposure, of judgment, didn't apply here. Not unless I brought it in with me. "It's not that simple," I whispered. "It is," she countered. "It's exactly that simple. You're just used to making it hard because that's how you survived before." I grabbed the wrench, my knuckles white against the cold steel. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her she didn't understand the specific, suffocating weight of my ghosts. But looking at her, sitting calm and unflinching in the firelight, I had the sinking realization that she understood perfectly. I retreated back to the lab, but the defense was compromised. The suture I had stitched over my own desire, the tight, neat line of professionalism and distance, was pulling tight against the skin. It wasn't healing anything. It was just holding the infection in. And as the wind outside began to change pitch, shifting from a low moan to a high, warning scream, I knew the thread was about to snap. The weather broke an hour later, and it didn't just close the door, it sealed the world shut. The storm arrived with the violence of a breaching whale, a sudden, massive displacement of air and pressure that made the entire tower shudder. Down in the lab, the water in my sample vials trembled in unison, concentric rings rippling out from the center. The temperature plummeted, a sharp, biting cold that leached through the stone foundation and made the air turn milky with breath. I had no choice but to go up. The lower levels were becoming uninhabitable, a freezer box of damp air and vibration. I climbed the stairs, feeling the wind scream against the exterior walls, a sound that wasn't just noise, but a physical assault on the structure. When I pushed open the hatch to the living quarters, the heat hit me, a wall of warmth from the wood stove that smelled of dry birch and roasting root vegetables. The world had shrunk. For the last week, I had the illusion of space, the jetty, the rocks, the endless horizon. Now, the horizon was gone, erased by a curtain of driving rain and gray foam. We were reduced to a 20-foot circle of stone and firelight. "Soup's not enough," Mara said. She was standing at the small galley counter, a knife in her hand. "Body burns more calories just trying to stay warm in this. I'm making a stew." I moved to help, and the kitchen became a landscape of near misses. It was a narrow crescent of space, barely wide enough for one person to work comfortably, impossible for two to navigate without negotiation. I washed the vegetables in the small steel sink while she chopped, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the blade against the wood acting as a metronome for the storm outside. "Behind you," I murmured, reaching for the salt on the shelf above her shoulder. "Go ahead," she said, not moving. I had to lean in. My chest brushed the back of her flannel shirt, a contact so fleeting it shouldn't have registered, but my nerves were already stripped raw by the isolation. I could smell the rain on her hair, the starch of her collar, and beneath that, the warm, living scent of her skin. The heat coming off her was magnetic. I grabbed the salt and pulled back, my breath hitching in a way I hoped the roar of the wind concealed. We worked in a tight, efficient loop, chopping, stirring, seasoning. Every time she passed me to check the stove, the air between us compressed. It wasn't just that we were close, it was that we were aware. I tracked her position in the room without looking, a radar sense that hummed at the base of my skull. When she handed me a plate, her fingers grazed mine, and the sensation was a sharp, static shock that had nothing to do with the dry air. Mara reached into the high cupboard and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, the label dark and peeling. She poured 2 generous, distinct glasses without asking. "Medicinal," she said, sliding one across the scarred wood of the table. We sat near the stove, the stew steaming between us, the storm raging against the glass like it wanted in. I took a sip of the whiskey. It was peat-heavy and sharp, burning a clean path down my throat. "You said you didn't leave the city to hide," I said, the alcohol loosening the knot in my chest just enough to speak. "But this," I gestured to the shaking walls, "this is extreme." Mara swirled her glass, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. In the city, everything was filtered. The air, the water, the conversations. You spend your whole life in a temperature-controlled box, negotiating with people who say one thing and mean another. It felt thin, like I was fading out. She looked at me, her eyes dark and serious. Here, the wind tries to push you off the gallery. The cold tries to freeze you. The ocean tries to rust everything you own. It's brutal, but it's real. I wanted to feel something that wasn't manufactured. "And do you?" I asked. "Feel it?" "Every day," she said softly. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. A slow, deliberate transit that made my pulse hammer against my ribs. I feel everything. The cold, the heat, the pull. She didn't specify what was pulling. She didn't have to. My breath hitched. The storm outside was nothing compared to the pressure building inside the room. We were trapped in a stone bottle, and the cork was about to blow. The hours unspooled, unmoored from any clock. Outside, the storm had solidified into a constant, vibrating backdrop, a wall of white noise that made the silence inside the tower feel pressurized, like the air inside a diving bell. We had moved past the polite chatter of dinner, past the logistics of the weather. The whiskey bottle sat between us on the worn floorboards, the level inching down, not from excess, but from a slow, deliberate sipping that matched the cadence of the wind. I watched her. It was dangerous, I knew, to look this closely. But the alcohol had eroded the sharp edges of my usual caution. Mara was leaning back in the canvas chair, her legs stretched out toward the stove, boots unlaced. The firelight did things to her face, sharpening the angle of her jaw, softening the hollow of her throat, catching the dark intent in her eyes whenever she blinked. She looked completely at rest, a stillness that was almost predatory in its patience. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was waiting it out. And I realized, with a jolt that settled low and heavy in my stomach, that she was waiting for me, too. She said quietly. She didn't look at me, her gaze fixed on the iron grate of the stove where the embers pulsed. You check them 3 times a day. You measure the oxygen, the salinity, the drift. What are you actually looking for down there? The question hung in the warm air, heavy and loaded. It wasn't about marine biology. We both knew that. It was about the way I checked the locks on the door, the way I organized my supplies to avoid needing help, the way I had spent the last month measuring the distance between us in inches, terrified of the variable that might close the gap. I said, the word felt small in the room, swallowed by the roar of the wind. Mara turned her head then. The firelight shifted, painting half her face in shadow. I admitted. The confession slipped out before I could catch it, raw and unplanned. She didn't speak. She just held my gaze. The suture I had stitched over my own desire, the tight, neat line of professionalism, was dissolving. Slowly, she stood up. The movement was fluid, unfolding from the chair with that deceptive grace I had noticed on the first day. She picked up the iron poker and moved to the stove, stoking the dying embers until they flared orange. Then she turned. She didn't go back to her chair. She stopped in front of me, close enough that her shadow fell across my lap. The heat from the stove was intense, but the heat coming off her was sharper. I could smell the rain that had soaked into her wool sweater earlier, the dry snap of the cedar wood, and beneath it all, the clean, warm scent of her skin. It was intoxicating. She said, "It wasn't a question. It was an observation." My breath hitched. I looked up at her, my neck craning back. From this angle, she looked monumental, the architect of this entire isolated world. "No," I whispered. "I'm not." She took a half step closer. Her hand twitched at her side, as if she were about to reach out, to bridge the final few inches that separated us. The air between us coiled tight, a physical pressure that made my skin prickle. I wanted her to move. I wanted her to break the line. I wanted the collision. But before her hand could lift, before the tension could snap into action, a sound tore through the room. A grinding metallic shriek from above that vibrated through the stone floor. The light. The trance shattered. Mara didn't hesitate. She was already moving, her boots hammering against the iron treads of the spiral staircase. I scrambled after her, the alcohol in my system burning off instantly. We burst into the lantern room, and the chaos was absolute. The storm, which had been a muffled roar downstairs, was deafening here. The wind hammered against the reinforced glass with enough force to make the panes bow inward, breathing with the pressure. But the real problem was the light. The massive Fresnel lens, usually a silent, rotating giant, had seized. It was shuddering on its track, the rotation mechanism fighting against a jam that threatened to strip the gears. Mara shouted over the noise, her voice cracking like a whip. She threw open the access panel at the base of the lens pedestal. The smell was acrid, hot grease and scorching metal. The red emergency lights bathed the room in a bloody, pulsing glow. Mara was already on her knees, wrestling with a heavy iron lever, trying to disengage the drive motor before it burned out. She yelled, her face streaked with grease and sweat. I nodded, grabbing the heavy brass crank handle on the side of the pedestal. The metal was freezing, slick with condensation and oil. I threw my weight against the crank. It wouldn't budge. The resistance was immense, a dead weight of tons of glass and iron. I gritted my teeth, digging my boots into the metal grating of the floor, pulling until the muscles in my back screamed. "Harder!" Mara roared. She was practically inside the machinery now, one arm buried deep in the gears, the other bracing against the pedestal. I shifted my grip, abandoning caution. I wasn't a scientist anymore. I was a counterweight. I locked my core and pulled with everything I had. Slowly, agonizingly, the crank turned. Half an inch. An inch. The floor beneath us was slick with water leaking from the storm vent. As I pulled, my boot slipped on the wet iron. I lurched forward, my grip slipping on the brass handle. Mara didn't look up, but her hand shot out, grabbing my belt blindly, anchoring me. Her grip was iron hard, grounding me instantly. "Don't let go." The contact was visceral. In the chaos of the storm, with the red light pulsing and the wind screaming, her hand on my hip wasn't just support. It was a tether. I regained my footing, using her grip as a fulcrum, and threw my weight back again. She grunted. I watched the muscles in her arm cord and strain as she fought the metal. Her wet shirt clung to her back, mapping the line of her spine, the tension in her shoulders. It was a raw, kinetic display of strength that hit me harder than the fear. She wasn't just fixing a machine. She was wrestling the storm to a standstill. With a final, sickening clunk, the pin seated. The resistance on the crank vanished so suddenly, I almost fell backward. "Clear!" Mara shouted, pulling her arm free. The massive lens groaned, then shuddered, and finally began to turn. The beam of light swept across the glass, cutting a bright, blinding swath through the rain outside. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the rotation returned, steady and reassuring. We collapsed back against the cold glass of the lantern room wall, sliding down until we hit the floor. My chest was heaving, my lungs burning with the effort. Mara was next to me, her breathing ragged, grease smeared across her cheekbone like war paint. The danger had passed, but the adrenaline hadn't. It was still flooding my veins, sharp and electric. We sat there in the dark, illuminated only by the sweeping beam of the light, breathless and alive. The storm was still raging outside, but in here, the only sound that mattered was the synchronized rasp of our breathing. I looked at her, and the fear of the mechanical failure dissolved, replaced by a different kind of terrifying clarity. We had survived the crisis, but the real danger, the one that had started downstairs by the fire, was just beginning. We didn't speak until we were back in the living quarters. The descent down the spiral stairs felt precarious, my legs trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and the sudden, violent withdrawal of adrenaline. When the heavy steel door of the lantern room clicked shut behind us, sealing away the screaming wind and the blinding sweep of the light, the silence of the tower felt sudden and absolute. The warmth of the wood stove hit us like a physical wall. It was a stark, dizzying contrast to the freezing chaos above. The air here was still thick with the scent of the stew we had abandoned and the sharp, peat smoke smell of the whiskey. I leaned back against the curved stone wall, sliding down until my boots hit the floorboards, my chest heaving as I tried to pull enough oxygen into my lungs. I was soaked. The rain had driven through the vents in the lantern room, plastering my shirt to my skin. And now that the danger was over, the cold was setting in. I started to shiver, not a subtle tremor, but a racking, uncontrollable shudder that rattled my teeth. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the crash. The survival instinct that had kept me moving was evaporating, leaving me raw and exposed. Mara was pacing near the stove, wiping grease from her hands with a rag. She stopped when she heard my breath hitch. She turned, tossing the rag onto the table, and crossed the room in 3 long strides. Quote 87, she said. Her voice was low, stripped of the command tone she'd used upstairs. It was quiet, intimate. I stammered, the lie clumsy and obvious. She corrected. She reached out, her hand hovering for a fraction of a second before she committed. She touched my cheek. Her fingers were rough, calloused from the work, but her palm was incredibly warm. She didn't ask. She just claimed the space. She slid her hand down to my neck, her thumb resting against the pulse point that was hammering a frantic rhythm against my skin. She was checking me, a professional assessment of hypothermia or shock. But the way her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes, changed the context entirely. The professional barrier hadn't just been breached. The storm had washed it away completely. She murmured. It wasn't a promise of safety from the elements. It was an acknowledgement of the gravity between us. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, dark, wet strands framing a face that was open in a way I had never seen before. The guarded, efficient lighthouse keeper was gone. In her place was a woman standing in the wreckage of her own defenses, waiting for me to make the choice. I didn't think, I just moved. I reached out and took hold of the front of her damp wool sweater, the fabric rough under my fingers, and pulled her toward me. Mara didn't resist. She stepped into the space between my knees, collapsing the distance until there was no air left to breathe. She brought her other hand up to cup my face, tilting my head back, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that felt like it could strip paint from the walls. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her breath ghosting against my lips. "I'm done running," I said. And I meant it. She kissed me then. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't a question. It started slow, a sultry confirmation of everything the silence had promised for weeks. Her mouth was warm, tasting of salt and rain, and the contact was electric. It wasn't the frantic energy of the storm. It was the deep, heavy power of the tide coming in. I made a sound in the back of my throat, a quiet surrender, and wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her flush against me. The sensation of her weight, solid, real, undeniable, anchored me. The dampness of our clothes, the cold of the stone floor, the roar of the wind outside, it all faded into background noise. The only reality was the heat of her skin, the strength of her hands tangling in my wet hair, and the terrifying, wonderful realization that I wasn't just surviving the isolation anymore. I was finally, completely awake. The fear I had carried for years, the fear of exposure, of judgment, of wanting too much, dissolved in the heat of that embrace. There was no room for ghosts here. There was only the firelight, the stone walls, and the unflinching desire that had finally, inevitably, been revealed. The silence woke me. After 20 hours of wind screaming against the stone, the sudden stillness was aggressive, a physical vacuum that pulled me out of sleep. I opened my eyes to a light that was painfully sharp. The storm had scrubbed the atmosphere clean, leaving the morning sun to cut through the salt-crusted portholes with a high-contrast clarity that exposed every grain of dust in the air. I lay there for a long moment, staring at the curved ceiling, waiting. This was usually the danger zone, the morning after, the precise geometric point where the adrenaline of the night before evaporated and the panic set in. I knew the script well, the sudden, crushing weight of regret, the frantic mental calculus of how to retreat, the overwhelming urge to pack my bags and flee back to the safety of solitude. I waited for the familiar tightening in my chest, the defensive walls to slam back into place, but they didn't. Instead, I felt a steady, rhythmic calm, heavy and grounding like the ballast stones in the foundation of the tower. The shame I had been trained to expect, the fear that I had given away too much, that I had made myself vulnerable in a way that could be weaponized, was simply absent. In its place was a quiet, unflinching certainty. I stretched, feeling the ache in my muscles from the manual crank, and realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't waking up preparing for a fight. I was just waking up. I swung my legs out of the bunk. The floorboards were still freezing, a reminder that the lighthouse didn't care about our revelations. But the cold felt bracing rather than hostile. I pulled on my wool sweater, the one that still smelled faintly of the storm and the ozone from the lantern room, and walked into the main living space. Mara was already there, standing at the galley counter. The routine was the same. The manual grinder crunching beans, the kettle hissing on the stove. But the cadence had shifted. Before, her movements had been efficient, contained, a performance of solitude. Now, they were open. She heard my footsteps and didn't stiffen. She didn't brace herself. I walked up behind her. I didn't announce myself. I didn't hesitate. I reached out and rested my hand on the small of her back, just above the hip. It was a small gesture, domestic and simple, but it felt radical. In the city, a touch like that would have been a question, a negotiation of boundaries. Here, it was a statement. Mara paused in her grinding. She didn't turn around immediately. Instead, she leaned back, just a fraction of an inch, pressing her weight against my hand. It was a subtle acknowledgement, a silent confirmation that the connection hadn't vanished with the storm. She said, her voice rough with sleep, but warm. I replied, stepping up beside her. She turned then, handing me a mug. Her eyes were clear, stripped of the guarding shadows she usually wore like armor. She looked at me, at my messy hair, my tired eyes, the way I was leaning into her space without apology. And she smiled. It wasn't a polite smile. It was a candid, knowing expression that made my breath hitch. We drank in silence, leaning against the counter, shoulders brushing. The tension that had defined our mornings for weeks, the charged, coiled energy of avoiding each other, was gone. It had been replaced by a different kind of electricity, a steady, humming current of awareness. We weren't two satellites orbiting each other anymore, terrified of collision. We were a binary system, locked in a stable, gravitational dance. Quote 97, she said, nodding toward the window where the ocean was a flat, brilliant blue. I said. She repeated, testing the word. She set her mug down and turned to face me fully, trapping me against the counter with her gaze. I said, feeling a flicker of the old fear. Mara said. She reached out, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw, a touch that was both gentle and possessive. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a demand. It was a validation of the space I had taken up in her tower and in her life. She was telling me that this wasn't a temporary shelter from the storm. It was a merger of solitudes. I'm not planning on leaving, I said, the truth of it surprising me even as I spoke. I think I'm just starting to see things clearly. Mara nodded, her thumb brushing my cheekbone. Good, because the view from here is better when you're not looking for an exit. I realized then that she was right. I had spent so long treating the lighthouse as a hiding place, a fortress to keep the world out. But standing there in the sharp morning light, with her hand on my face and the smell of coffee and cedar in the air, I saw it for what it really was. It wasn't a place to hide. It was a vantage point. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what I could see. When the supply boat finally returned, the sound of its diesel engine felt like an intrusion from a different timeline. I heard the low, guttural thrum cutting through the rhythmic crash of the surf long before the white hull crested the swell. 6 weeks ago, that sound would have triggered a frantic, conditioned response, a scramble to pack crates, to seal logbooks, to prepare my face for the polite, suffocating mask I wore for the world. Today, I just stood on the gallery deck, leaning my weight against the cold iron railing, watching the vessel cut a straight, stubborn line through the gray water. The captain waved from the wheelhouse, a tiny, distant figure against the chop. I lifted a hand in return, a slow, casual gesture. My feet didn't shift. I wasn't bracing for a departure. I was simply watching a visitor approach the place I lived. The door behind me opened, and Mara stepped out onto the metal grating. She didn't speak immediately. She just moved to the rail and rested her elbows on the iron, mirroring my posture. The wind was sharp, whipping strands of dark hair across her face, but she didn't bother to brush them away. We stood shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but close enough that the heavy wool of our coats created a single, unified barrier against the cold. The heat of her presence was a constant, steady pressure against my side, a reminder of the reality we had built inside the stone. "He's got your mail," she said, her voice snatched away by the wind, but I felt the vibration of it in the air between us. "And likely a dozen questions from the harbor master about why you haven't radioed for a pickup date. They probably have a pool going on whether you cracked up or washed away." "Let them ask," I said. The words felt solid in my mouth, heavy and real like the stones of the tower. "I'll send the samples back with him. The data is all there. But the researcher is staying." Mara turned her head to look at me, her eyes narrowing slightly against the glare. The corner of her mouth quirked up, a private signal. "People will talk. You know that. The town loves a scandal more than a good catch. 2 women alone in a tower? We're writing their fiction for them. They'll call it a retreat, or a breakdown, or something worse." I looked out at the mainland, a smudge of green and gray on the horizon. I thought about the whispers in the faculty lounge, the polite exclusions, the way I had let the fear of other people's narratives dictate the geography of my own life for so long. It all seemed so small from up here. The distance wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional. Their opinions were just noise, as inconsequential as the gulls crying over the wake. "Let them talk," I said, turning to meet her gaze, unflinching. "Their version of the story is small. It's safe. It doesn't have this." I gestured to the vast, terrifying expanse of the ocean, and then, more specifically, to the charged space between us. "They think we're hiding. They don't understand that we're the only ones who can actually see." It wasn't the storm that had changed me. It wasn't even the intimacy, though that had been a revelation of its own. It was that moment in the lantern room, weeks ago. That split second where her hand brushed mine, and I had to decide whether to recoil into safety or to lean into the terrifying unknown. That was the catalyst. But standing here now, watching the boat dock below, I realized that the brush was just gravity. This, the decision to let the boat leave without me, to stand in the wind and claim this space, this was the love story. The boat engine revved, reversing out of the slip, leaving a white scar of foam on the water. I didn't watch it go. I looked at Mara. Her hand found mine on the railing, her fingers lacing through mine, deliberate, warm, and completely open. If you believe that the quietest moments hold the loudest truths, hit subscribe right now to follow the rest of the journey.